Sure. Well, let's start with the baseline. The only reason we're even talking about China is a significant power is because of globalization. It was the end of World War II settlement that removed the Europeans from the capacity of intervening in China. It was the end of World War II and the settlement with the Japanese that prevented the colonization of China. Japan was winning in China right up until the bombs fell on Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and then all of a sudden the Chinese environment changed overnight. All the foreigners left, and the Chinese could fight their own internal civil war, which eventually the communists won. Later on, we reached a juncture 2 decades down the line when the Soviets and the Chinese engaged in nearly nuclear conflict over border disputes. Enter Nixon and Kissinger, and the rest is history because we basically convinced the Chinese to switch sides. They joined the globalized system, and in turn for turning their backs on the Soviets, that is what set up the strategic environment for China's growth ever since. However, that is not sustainable without intervention from the United States or globalization in general. The line of islands off the Chinese coast, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, if there's one thing they all agree on, it's that they're not China, and the Chinese have never been able to project power beyond that, except during the global order because the Americans have forced everyone to be on the same side. That's breaking down now, and the Chinese don't have the capacity in any form to project power much beyond their own coastline. They do have a lot of ships. 90% of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from shore, and that assumes they're going at a slow speed to save fuel in a straight line and no one's shooting at them. Really, China can barely make it past Taiwan, and China is the most internationalized economy in terms of its resource and its market dependence. So if the global system breaks down, that is it, the Chinese system implodes. And if China finds itself in a real war with anyone, someone, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, the Indians, the Americans, someone is going to put a couple of destroyers in the Persian Gulf or in the Indian Ocean and cut the energy line. Because the United States hasn't been the world's largest energy supporter for some time. Over a decade, it's China. China imports 85% of their energy, and 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf, and the Chinese can't reach the Persian Gulf. So any breakdown in the regional or the global order, and it's lights out. Always keep in mind that agriculture in China has become highly industrialized, and they rely heavily on importing most of the inputs for this sector. So you're talking about the lights going out, the trucks stopping, and famine. A great example is what's going on with the Ukraine war. So there is this belief in China that the Russians will take Ukraine first. It'll kind of prove the theory that we have that we can take Taiwan easily. Clearly, that's not the case, because while the Russians are clearly not performing to snuff, the Ukrainian army is not a regular army. They're doing great, don't get me wrong, but the power mismatch in that is not nearly as big as the power mismatch between China and Taiwan, because the Taiwanese have been preparing for this war now for 70 years, and they have a lot of modern equipment. And oh yeah, they're still an island, so scratch one. They know the strategic relationship will not go the way they were hoping. They're terrified of the boycotts and the sanctions because the idea that shareholders would back away is something that they can't deal with economically. They need those connections in order to employ their own population, and the sanctions, say what you will about the Russian economy. It's a major exporter of both foodstuffs and energy, and the Chinese are major importers of both. If we were to impose sanctions on the Chinese system similar to those applied to Russia, it would spell the end. It would crumble in under a year. And then if you just need one more reason, it's like, I think this is plenty demographics. The one-child policy started 40 years ago. They're literally running out of workers and consumer. It's the fastest aging society in human history. And some of the data they've been leaking out of the 2020 decade census suggests that this is them suggesting that they've actually overcounted their population by about 100 million people. And that's all people who were born since the one-child policy, and it's probably the vast majority of them being women. So there is no hope for a demographic reconstitution of this country. We've always known for demographics it was going to collapse this century because they're aging so fast. There'll be less than half as many people in 2100 as there are now, assuming nothing goes wrong with anything else. And now with this new data from the census, we may have to speed that date up by 50 years. So in my opinion, this decade was always going to be the decade where the Chinese system completely collapsed. We're losing our boogeyman. I believe we'll manage when the rules of the game change. I adapt my perspective. That's how it operates. Yeah, nuclear and coal are feasible options for them for electricity. That is absolutely true. Their nuclear power plants are by far not the most efficient in the world, but they get the job done, and they have plenty of soft coal. My concern, because of the demographic stance, is far more basic, though. If you don't have enough people to consume, you don't have enough to fuel your economic system. And so the Chinese have always been dependent far more than most on imports for the raw commodities and then exports for the finished goods. So you can't do that without a globalized system. So you're talking about the best case scenario here being in a North Korea-like environment where the food goes away but the power stays on. It could be worse. Chinese history is replete with examples of it being worse, but what you just identified is probably the best case scenario for bulls. No, it should be yuan, but it's not convertible, so you're going to have to fly those to you a pallet at a time, and we don't want any of them back ever. And the Indians are like, well, hey, rupees, let's use rupees. And so, it's only been 6 months, and all of those plans have imploded, and the U.S.'s dollar role in the global system has gone up, even because the euro now has basically hitched itself to the dollar as a secondary support system rather than its own independent pole. And same with the Japanese. So, there's just no alternative here. There's no other option. On the investment side, the Chinese have had a reputation for using a lot of capital flight and a lot of export earnings to purchase what they consider to be strategic assets around the world. And that has generated a lot of heartburn in a lot of places. Well, they now know that that's pointless because the Germans, who are, let's say not, or should I put this, made some poor strategic decisions over the course of the last 30 years as regards to the Russians. They're already nationalizing Russian assets in Germany. No, the Germans, the ones who are the pacifists and the socialists. So the Chinese are now realizing that everything they bought overseas is worthless, and they're trying to sell a lot of it so at least they'll get some cash out of it. Well, step one, I'm a generalist. So I do finance, I do demography, I do manufacturing, and I do ag. I do a lot of things. My bases are obviously demographics and geography, but that doesn't do anything if you can't apply it to the people who are in front of you. So we started out doing consulting and it eventually turned into public speaking. I have a lot of fun on stage. I usually have a bourbon and a coffee, and it's a good time for everybody. Some of the joy's gone out of it in the last month because, we've got to start talking about the war, but if you can't make the information accessible and applicable, I would just be another consultant with a head in a book. I try to be more than that, and that means I have to learn the world from every client's point of view for each individual presentation or consulting event that is alternatively really exciting based on the client, what they care about. It can be a little depressing. I don't always have good news, and so it's in the delivery in many cases so that you don't encourage people to find the nearest balcony to jump off of. Second, the books are my way of having a conversation with myself, so to speak. Every presentation I give is different. It's tailored for the audience, and since the book is a general audience, it involves both educating and forecasting as well as helping people comprehend the path that led us to our current situation. And the new book, particularly The End of the World, is just the beginning. Does that from an economic point of view as well as a strategic one. So the first three books that I did are kind of in the rise and fall of nations. Genre and this new one is, here's what the world we're going to be living in for the next 30 years is going to look like. And hang on.